You're listening to Fast Facts Perio Edition. And now, here's your host, Katrina Sanders.
Hello, and welcome to Fast Facts Perio Edition. I cannot wait to unpack this research study today because this is quite an interesting study. This is one of the longest cohort studies in my research that has been done around periodontitis. So this research study began at enrollment in 1968. So this has been just over 50 years. So it began in 1968, and participants inside of this study, over 1,000 participants, had routine comprehensive medical examinations and oral examinations about every 3 years from 1968 through 2007. What they wanted to identify inside of this was the risk of periodontitis associated with a hazard for mortality. Now, this was quite progressive at the time. They're looking back now to 1968. At this time, we really began to start identifying some of the inflammatory conditions of not just periodontitis, but also systemic disease. And I'll be the first to tell you, as a dental hygienist, it really didn't occur to me when I chose to go to dental hygiene school and or even when I'm performing a periodontal assessment on my patients that I am interacting in a very specific way with life or death. In this particular research study, spanning longitudinally with a cohort study over 50 years, it was noted that as alveolar bone loss scores increased, so as we began to see a downward movement in alveolar bone loss, we saw an increase in the hazard of mortality. So get this, for every 20% that we lose alveolar bone, there is a 14% increased risk of that individual's mortality. So let's think about this big scale here. If we take a look, and for those of you who are driving, please do not write this down while you're driving. But if you take a look at a patient who is considered a stage 1 periodontal case, that patient in stage 1 has radiologic bone loss of 15% or less. When we move a patient into stage 2 disease, that patient has radiologic bone loss anywhere between 15 to 33%. So at a minimum, by the time the patient moves into stage 2 disease, they are probably close to that early 20% increment of alveolar bone loss. By the time the patient moves into a stage 2 scenario, there is a likeliness that that individual is already experiencing a 14% increase in hazard of mortality. And that is associated with the amount of periodontal inflammation that has now leveraged the downward movement of that alveolar bone. Now we see a patient in stage 3 periodontitis, for example. Stage 3 periodontitis is characterized as deep periodontal lesions that extend into the middle third of the root and beyond. So we're looking at 33% radiologic bone loss or greater in a patient with that stage 3 periodontitis. So in a stage 3 case, there's a likeliness at a minimum that that patient has a 14% increase in their hazard for mortality. Or if that patient has, for example, 40% alveolar bone loss, that patient now has a 28% increase in their hazard of mortality. The more that and I will say this was done utilizing a very specific 5-point ruler that is routinely used to measure alveolar bone loss. So this calibrated piece of equipment was used to section that root into 5 sections and to view those increments at 20% increments. As we continue to see advancement, so now let's talk about a patient in stage 4 periodontitis. A patient in stage 4 periodontitis is characterized as a stage 4 periodontal patient because they have experienced so much overt bone loss, or so many teeth are experiencing a hopeless prognosis because of their periodontal condition that these teeth are being removed. The patient is in masticatory dysfunction because of the amount of teeth that have been removed because of periodontitis. So a patient in a stage 4 scenario is likely somebody who has quite advanced increments of alveolar bone loss, as you can imagine. These are patients in which their prognosis has declined because of either that alveolar bone loss, furcation involvements, perhaps mobility that has occurred. That hopeless prognosis is directly tied to alveolar bone loss in many cases. So now let's think about that advanced stage 4 periodontal patient where the amount of bone loss is likely high enough where now we're beginning to see an extreme concern around the hazard for mortality. This is where we really do have the opportunity to change the verbiage, the vernacular that we're using to help our patients understand. You see, we recognize that patients will sit in our chairs and they do, in fact, have increments of alveolar bone loss. How often are we helping patients understand that a critical aspect of their longevity is our prevention of continual movement of that alveolar bone? How often do we help our patients understand that when they are sitting in our chairs receiving periodontal assessments, that what we're doing is not only screening for periodontal conditions, but we're also screening for the plausibility of systemic disease. And subsequently now, according to this data published in September of 2022, that now we can readily utilize the increments of alveolar bone loss to predict the hazards of mortality for our periodontally involved patients. This, to me, truly gives us an opportunity to change some of that vernacular. So if I'm thinking about a hygienist integrating this into their clinical practice, perhaps a way to support educating our patients in this could be something like, Mr. Jones, today I will be measuring your gum tissues. We are going to be measuring these areas with a ruler as well as taking dental radiographs. This data gives us information not only about the condition of your mouth, but new research is now telling us that if we are seeing advancement of bone loss on your radiographs, that it demonstrates a positive association with mortality risk. So we would like to gather these assessments to make sure that we are carefully and comprehensively evaluating your oral health as it relates to your overall health and your longevity. Let's get started. It's hard for a reasonable person to find an argument inside of the necessity for gathering assessments like this. This has been another episode of Fast Facts, Perio Edition with Katrina Sanders. Please feel free to reach me on Instagram at The Dental Wine Genist or on my website, www.katrinasanders.com. Cheers.